Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Savannah Harinque if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Wednesday, September the 21st, and today we are talking about the scheduled execution in Alabama of Alan Eugene Miller, set for tomorrow at 6 p.m. Now, it's currently called off, and we're going to get into why we're still talking about it here in just a minute. But today I am joined by one of our managing producers at AL.com, Kent Falk. Kent has years of experience in covering courts, covering the death penalty in Alabama, and covering executions. So, Kent, thank you for joining us here today. I know that a lot of people have been very interested in this case. They've been following it, especially with all of the revelations in the last week or so about the state and its processes regarding executions. But first, let's talk a little bit about the process where we are now. So, right now, Alan Miller, again, execution scheduled for tomorrow. A district judge, so that just means a federal judge in Montgomery, essentially, called off the execution on Monday. So why are we still talking about it, Kent? Could this still go off tomorrow, or what do we know?
Well, at this point, the Attorney General's office, which represents the Department of Corrections and the state in general, has appealed the Judge Huffaker's ruling from Monday, saying that basically saying that the executions should still go forward, and depending on what happens before the 11th Circuit, which could be today or sometime tomorrow, or maybe they don't address it. But that's very rare that they wouldn't. But at some point, it's likely that the 11th Circuit will make a ruling to either uphold or affirm Judge Huffaker's ruling, and then whatever that ruling is, will be either appealed by the state if it goes against the state, or it would be appealed by Miller's attorneys if they say, yeah, the execution can go on now. So then that would be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then we'd wait on a ruling from there. So it could come down to, again, as it's done so many times that you are well aware of, going down to executions, not knowing what the Supreme Court's going to rule until the time of the execution, or even after the set time for the execution, which is 6 p.m. Thursday.
Well, and Ken, I always explain to people when they ask about what in the world is happening with these rulings being appealed. It's just going through court process in the days before executions. I always say it's like volleyball. You have one ruling, it again gets appealed by either side. It could go back and forth for days or even for hours, like you said, leading up to the execution. Now, again, we know that death warrant that has been issued for Alan Miller, which is not specific to Alan Miller, whenever a death warrant is issued, it's always good for that 24-hour period. So essentially what that means is past 11:59 p.m. on Thursday night, if an order comes out from a higher court that says, sure, you can go ahead and execute him, if it's not done by midnight on Thursday, so 11:59 p.m. Thursday, 12:01 a.m. Friday, then it can't happen. We have to go through this process all over again. So you explained about how if the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals upholds the district court judge's ruling calling off the execution, then the state will likely appeal that to the U.S. Supreme Court. Tell me how that works, Kent. Tell me how it works with the court, especially this is not a normal time for the Supreme Court. They're not in session at this exact moment. So how does that work if the state calls the Supreme Court and says, hey, we're appealing this?
Well, they file electronically with the U.S. Supreme Court, and then the court clerk at SCOTUS sends it to the justice who's over the 11th Circuit. That would be Judge Thomas, and he would take that and distribute it to the rest of the court, and their clerks would send it to the justices, and they would all look at it and decide what they want to do, and feed their comments back to Judge Thomas and have a vote. It's not. It's very unclear as exactly how that vote takes place, particularly in the off season, quote off season, when they're not in session. And usually these things come down to, late 5, 6 o'clock Central Time, and no one's still in the office in Washington D.C. at 7, 8 o'clock when they get it, their time. And so it's all done virtually from their homes. They'll take a vote, and we're assuming some of this is assumption, but it's pretty good, that they take a vote by phone, and then they electronically file their responses to Judge Thomas, who collects it and then issues the opinion from the Supreme Court. So there's this back and forth between the justices, and they render their decision. And sometimes it's quick, and sometimes it's not, especially if one of the justices wants to make a dissenting opinion from what the others are saying, to say why something should or shouldn't be done. So it's just a process, and it's anybody's guess as to why some of these appeals happen so close to the time of the executions rather than a month or two out.
Well, and it should be noted, Kent, we have seen this in pretty much every death row inmate set to die in Alabama. The same type of legal wranglings, always, of course, a different topic. Different appeals vary based on the circumstances of the case and the inmate, but this is not an unusual process. I think it's fair to say these last minute filings, these last minute appeals, and the going back and forth between courts. So we know right now the 11th has not issued a ruling. So that means that the lower court's order staying the execution is in place. So how long does the 11th have to make that decision?
Well, they can wait as long as they want to, basically. They're not under any I don't know that they're in any requirement to rule by a certain time, but they generally do rule a day, the day before, within 24 hours of the execution. So that's been the habit, but I'm not clear as whether they have an absolute mandate that they have to issue a ruling by a specific time. But they generally do it.
Well, and also, right. And also, it doesn't seem like there is any hard and fast rule that says they have to issue a ruling before Thursday at midnight, which, again, if they issued a ruling on Friday saying, sure, the execution can go forward, it's a moot point at that rate, because on Friday, as we have already talked about, that death warrant is not good. It would have to go back through the Alabama Supreme Court to set that date. So it is a little bit of a game of timing here to get everything done in time for that set execution on Thursday. Now, Kent, a big part of this case, a lot of questions that people have had, especially on social media, have revolved around the use of nitrogen hypoxia here. That's what Alan Miller says he chose to die by. The state says, no, he did not choose that. And what that lower court said was not necessarily the execution cannot go forward. That lower court said it cannot go forward using lethal injection. Tell me a little bit about what we know about the state and their readiness to use nitrogen hypoxia, and why don't they just do that instead on Thursday?
We know very little about their plans for a device that's going to be used for for nitrogen hypoxia, and they've been very closed. They just haven't talked about it, and there have been several states that have also said they're going to reuse nitrogen hypoxia, but they never have. They haven't so far. If Alabama did, it would be the first one to use it. Um, so just how they would do it, what type of equipment they would use, and uh, the process or procedures they would use. The state has not publicly said that and anything about it. The only glimpse we've had about how they would do it is in a court filing, I believe you're very familiar with, in which the state said they tried to fit Alan Miller with a mask to try to, find out the dimensions of the mask that would be neat to use. So now we kind of know that there's going to be a mask in which they would put the nitrogen in, make him breathe pure nitrogen, basically asphyxiating him because he couldn't breathe oxygen. So that's about all we know about what they're hoping to do. But they recently said, "Oh, we're ready." And it was in a hearing you covered. They said, "I think we're ready, Judge." And then quickly they came back. When the judge said, "Are you really ready?" They said, "No, we're not ready." So um, that's where we stand. And the judge came back. Tell me exactly what did the judge say, Yvonne?
Well, the judge came back and said, again, not necessarily that you cannot execute Alan Eugene Miller, that he said you cannot execute Alan Eugene Miller using lethal injection. That is the 3-drug cocktail that has been used for executions for several years in Alabama, that many advocates say is not acceptable and can cause torture, as some people have said. Again, some advocates say that other executions that have been conducted using that method have been botched, in their words. So it has been a controversial topic. So nitrogen hypoxia gets approved in 2018 to be an approved method of execution. There is this window where inmates were allowed to select their method of execution. And then you fast forward years later, and it's still a topic of argument here in the courts. But I think it's interesting. The judge didn't necessarily say, we're staying this execution as we've seen in the past. This judge said, I'm staying it only due to the method. If you somehow could come up with a way to conduct nitrogen hypoxia executions by Thursday evening, sure. And I thought that was interesting because the judge was not necessarily saying, again, you can't execute him. He was saying you cannot use this method. And that is something that the state has also argued in their filing to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The state has said, well, this is actually a delay tactic. They have alleged that the entire use or the execution method lawsuit is just a way to delay for Alan Miller to delay his execution, which of course he denies. So that's kind of the nugget of this case that is going back and forth. And again, that it's likely we'll play volleyball with for several days. Kent, tell us, how long has Alabama used lethal injection as the primary method of execution?
For about 21, 22 years. I think originally when Alan Miller was sentenced to death, he was sentenced to electrocution by the judge. And that may have been changed later, but the state introduced lethal injection and basically left it open to the inmates to decide, that were already on death row, decide whether they wanted to go with lethal injection or the electrocution in the what they call the yellow mama chair. So we're now faced with another situation where inmates were asked in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
To choose lethal injection or the new method, nitrogen hypoxia.
Well, an interesting note about that as well is that when the method of lethal injection became legal in Alabama, I believe in 2002, inmates were automatically enrolled in that method of execution. They had to decide if they wanted electrocution, then they had to make that known. But it was automatic, that if you did not come out and say, I would like to stay with the method of electrocution, then you went ahead and were enrolled in lethal injection. That's actually the opposite of what happened in 2018 with nitrogen hypoxia. Inmates had to say they wanted nitrogen hypoxia, otherwise they stuck with the old method. And I think that's an interesting thing to note, especially in this case, because that is the center of the argument. This is a completely opposite rollout than what happened with lethal injection, again, about 2 decades ago. Kent, I know you and I could talk about this all day, but what do you think is the most important thing for people to know going into, again, this process? And as we know, before we got on, we both checked the court filings here. The 11th Circuit Court had not issued a ruling, so execution is still off for Thursday. But what do you think is the most important thing that people should know?
Well, I think the execution still could happen. We've seen this before where the district judge, halts the execution, and then the 11th Circuit lifts it, or the 11th Circuit backs up the judge, and then so the Supreme Court reverses everybody below all the lower courts. So, but we've also seen it where the 11th Circuit didn't back up the judge and lifted the stay, and then it gets pushed up to the Supreme Court by the other side. And so I still think there's a possibility that this execution could still happen. And I think going forward, we really need to understand more about this new execution method, nitrogen hypoxia. I think the state needs to say more about exactly how this thing would work. And that's one of the things I'm most interested in. Besides the fact that you've got an individual who is facing the end of his life. And this particular case is not about a question of innocence. There's never been an argument that he didn't kill the 3 people. So let's keep that in mind. Let's keep the victims in mind too. But anyway.
And thank you for bringing that up, Kent, too. We should say that Alan Miller was convicted for an August 5th, 1999 workplace shooting in Shelby County in the Pelham area at 2 businesses, and was convicted of killing Terry Lee Jarvis, Lee Holdbrooks, and Christopher Scott Yancey. Again, Kent, thank you for all of your expertise here. And again, an important piece of information for people to leave, knowing that this could come down to the wire on Thursday evening. We will be keeping everybody updated, of course, on AL.com. You can go there for the latest information. We're going to leave a link here to the latest reporting on that case as well. Kent, thank you so much again for all of your information. Everybody watching, thank you so much, and we'll see you